Cool. Welcome, everyone. Thank you very much for being here. My name is Farah Al-Muslimi. I'm originally from Yemen. I think we're also alive already, no? Good. And I cover Yemen and Gulf at Chatham House. Today we have a conversation that's long overdue, but critically important, and it's online and in person. We have a very dear guest to talk about Yemen, but also, as much as it is about Yemen, it's about a larger conversation, the independence of aid, the current place of multilateralism, situation in Yemen, Syria, and Pakistan. So with us, we have Julian Hárness. He's the UN Assistant Secretary General and the Humanitarian Coordinator for Yemen. We have had the chance to engage for almost 12 years, since I was a student in college. And despite his experience in Lebanon and Congo, Pakistan, also Yemen in the past. You were in charge of the UNICEF before coming back. Obviously, I will not try to go into further conversation, but a few things to highlight. This meeting is on the record. It's broadcasted also online. It is also part of what we try to do at Chatham House. It's in the heart of our work, which is convening about conversations. It's a variety of conversations we have had, and it's also a conversation that we always try to hold at the Middle East and North Africa program, which looks into Yemen, Libya, the Gulf, Iran, North Africa, and a bunch of other varieties under the leadership of Dr. Sanam Vakil. Yemen is, according to the UN, the worst humanitarian crisis in the world. In my opinion, one of the worst. That's something we can debate, how you guys have your conversations and info and analysis. But the last few months, it has been crucial in the world of UN because of the recent abduction and detainees of the Houthis, to a bunch of UN staff workers, to a bunch of Yemen, them going after Yemeni researchers, activists, inside and outside Yemen, myself included, but accusing them of being foreign agents and moving in that quite ridiculous rhetorical. But today we will try to talk about more the independence of aid, but also a rare opportunity to talk about how things are in Sana'a at the moment. Thank you for being here, but can you start with telling us a little bit more situation in how is the current, I guess, priorities of the UN in Sana'a, but also the challenges you are facing of the UN delivery of aid and the complication of relationships with donors. And everyone who saw the event online basically asked me, ask Julian, what is going on with the detainees? So let's start from there, and then we can ask a few questions. If you are online, you can start actually putting your questions right now, and I will try to absorb them with the conversation. But after 15 minutes, we also will open it for those in the room. Without any further ado, welcome. And how's Sana'a?
Okay, well, Freya, it's great to see you again. I didn't realize you were a student 12 years ago.
You're old,
You always
man.
impressed me so much that. Well, Sana's, and it's good to see some friends I haven't seen in a long time in the audience. Thank you for receiving me. I was in Sana'a Saturday, stopped by in Amman yesterday, and here in London today. The situation in Yemen from a humanitarian perspective is getting worse. So every year we do a humanitarian response plan, and we're going through the calculations of what's the degree of severity of humanitarian need in Yemen. This year, 2024, is about 18 million, and we're expecting it to be about 19 million people in need for 2025. And that's not driven by a hot conflict. It is driven by the economic consequences of conflict. It is the impact of the Red Sea, the fighting in the Red Sea, which is impacting the economy. The years, now 10 years of conflict, and then subsequently kind of no peace, no war. For the last 2 years is having a destructive impact on Yemen's economy. The fact that essentially health services, education system does not barely works, and what it does work is essentially dependent upon money through the World Bank and through UN agencies. So you've got a degradation of the situation, which is increasing needs across the country, but particularly in the areas under the control of Sana. And at the same time, this comes in a very challenging geopolitical situation, in that when I was in Yemen for 4 years, from 2013 to 2017, and at that time there obviously was a conflict with Saudi Arabia, the coalition led by Saudi Arabia, but the funding for the humanitarian response came from countries that were not directly involved in the conflict, right? So you get the funding is typically 40% of the funding in the past has mainly come from the US, and then Western states, and then obviously a significant portion from the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. But at that time, the majority of the funding was coming from countries that were not actually involved in a conflict with the authorities in Sana'a. Move forward to now, and then obviously you have Ansar Allah firing rockets at ships in the Red Sea. You have the Americans and the British who are taking strikes in Yemen. And so you now have, it's not a war, but there is definitely violence between the two of those. And we in the humanitarian world are trying to bring money from people who are part of that conflict to people in an area controlled by their military opponents. And as a humanitarian organization, trying to straddle that is incredibly complex. And so when you ask about neutrality and partiality, how do we maintain humanitarian operations? What we need to do is we have a kind of three-way three ways of engagement. One is with the de facto authorities, is to negotiate the space for humanitarian operations so that we can do so without interference. Constant engagement, most of the time we're able to achieve that, but it's very wearing, it's very tiring, it involves a lot of effort. A little bit easier in the last month, I'd say.
How come so? What's easier? Because it looks to me and to a lot of Yemen observers that since the Houthis have basically abducted a bunch of your stuff and everyone, you chose to be silent as a UN, and there has not anything changed.
Well, let me talk a little bit about the other conversations, and I'll come back to that. Right? Okay. So, that's one is the negotiation with the de facto authorities in order to be able to operate. Also, discussions with the government of Yemen to be able to operate in the rest of Yemen. Okay. Then there is a discussion with the donors to ensure that they feel sufficient trust that the assistance that they provide, them taxpayers' money, that they give to us for humanitarian assistance goes to the right people and is not diverted, right? So there's trust building with donors, which is, they have very legitimate concerns and questions about how you do this, particularly since they can't travel to, or very few of them have been able to travel to areas under the control of Sana'a. So maintaining that relationship of trust. And so what I was doing yesterday in Amman was a workshop on risk management, which was with the donor community and with humanitarian organizations, was how do we maintain that trust? And then there is a third conversation, which is in my mind the most important conversation, is an engagement with Yemeni society, as much as that is possible, which is what do they want from humanitarian assistance? What's the most important things for, what's their view on it? And that's a work with OCHA, the Office of Coordination of Humanitarian Assistance. It's currently what we're doing with a series of engagements across the country, which is engaging with society in order to get their views on humanitarian priorities. So that's the three-way negotiation or the three-way discussion to be able to maintain humanitarian operations as neutral, as impartial as we can hope to. Now, your question about the detainees and what's changed. Well, there's two parts to that. So one is about the detentions, and then why do I say that things have changed a little bit in the last weeks, months? Right? Well, there's a lot to say about the detainees. I think the first thing to say is they are my colleagues. Right? These are people that I know, and they are people that we in the United Nations care deeply about, and are doing everything we can to get them released. Now we've got previously had 17 people detained, and obviously we've got a lot more Yemeni colleagues who work across the country. Across Yemen, we have 3,000 staff. About 60 to 65% of those in areas under the control of Sana. Right? So we've got a lot of employees, and my job number one is making sure that we're doing everything we can to look after them, and that they are able to operate. We haven't stayed silent. There have been statements by the Secretary General, repeated statements by the Secretary General calling for their release.
But why did it take you almost 2 months to say something about this publicly? Don't you think you compromised their safety?
Bless you, Freya. That's just factually incorrect.
Okay.
We've got, firstly, there is public advocacy, and
that's what I mean.
And there's private discussion.
Because that happened in the past in 2021 with the US Embassy, with the UN. You thought you can engage with the Houthis, in my opinion, and everyone was silent. And 3 years later, these people are still in jail.
So
pull it back about silence.
Yes.
Don't you think that's a problem?
So since the detentions in June, the UN has made 50 public statements on the detentions, each one of them calling for the release of our colleagues, the immediate release of our colleagues, and not just the immediate release of our colleagues, the release of all detainees, including detainees from the regime. We focus a lot on the detainees from the UN and the INGOs. Personally, the ones that I think have the most difficult prospects are those, the majority of the detainees who are actually from the from ministries and within the regime themselves. So
you're saying the Houthis even jailed their own people in this storm?
There were in June. Our understanding is there were detentions from civil society, but there was also detentions from many parts of the authorities in Sana.
So the minute that
so you were asking, we've been silent. We haven't been silent. Over 50 statements. The Secretary General's repeatedly condemned it. The heads of every single major UN agency who's implied in this have repeatedly called for their release. So far off being silenced. I indeed have focused on internal discussions within Yemen. And since the day after the detentions, I have been advocating to the authorities in Sana for the release of my colleagues, as have all the UN leaders in Sana.
Oh, a follow-up question to that
Sure.
is, some says the minute this happened that the UN should immediately suspend operations in northern Yemen.
Yeah.
If I am correct, your vision was no, that shouldn't happen, at least in the larger scheme of things.
Yeah.
Why do you think so?
Well, it's a General Assembly resolution, General Assembly Resolution 59, and multiple General Assembly resolutions put a positive obligation on the United Nations to save lives, even in areas of violence and difficulty and oppression. So, I don't get a choice on this. I'm a humanitarian. We have positive obligations to save lives. In Yemen, every hour, a child under 5 dies, right? Our humanitarian assistance stops that being 2 or 3 children. So, when we say, oh, just stop assistance, what you're talking about is how many people do you want to kill, right? Is it 10,000 children? Is it 20,000 children that we're going to allow to die, right? So, that very simple sounding question is you're talking about the lives of thousands of Yemeni children at risk. And these are Yemeni children who've no part in this conflict. The most vulnerable populations in Yemen are Mohamshin, is people on the Tihama. The worst malnutrition is on the Tihama along the coast. It's the situation of women. None of these people voted to have the political structures that they have in charge of them for any part of the country. These are people who are just trying to get by, live and survive, get their kids educated in a chaotic and dangerous environment. And we, as the United Nations, have an obligation to do everything that we can to support them, even at risk, in the same way that my colleagues in Gaza, despite the killings of more than 240 UN employees, UN colleagues in Gaza, we continue to operate in Gaza. In all conflicts, we, as humanitarians, accept that risk and manage it. Right.
Maybe, but I want to come back to the next one in regards to Gaza and the place you guys in the world right now. But I do want to dig up into what you said, life-saving activities, a little bit more. Yeah. Recently, we had the UN will shut down the non-life operations in northern Yemen.
Yeah.
What does that really mean? What's a life-saving operations? Because to me, almost everything that you guys are doing is alive, even if it has to do with the climate change. I find that quite a scary decision. Tell me more.
Yeah, so, well, I mean...
Like, what is a life-saving if you're saying that? How many people are you going to kill with that suspicions?
So, basically, first it is the sort of decision that I didn't come back to Yemen to take. I was 4 years in Yemen, and I was coming back to Yemen with the hope and aspiration that we would be moving towards peace and that I might be able to nudge the UN towards development. And obviously the conditions are not that. So in the areas under, we have greater possibilities to do development in the areas under the government of Yemen, and we are doing more and more there, and we need to do more and more. Right? In the areas under Sana, over the last 10 years, we've not done much in the way of development. I think I would estimate it as being less than 10% of our activities is development type activities, and that's because we've been doing operations in a conflict environment. I would like to have seen that changed, but the conditions are no longer present.
Even today?
I would have liked to have seen that change, but today
how much of your budget is development versus?
In the areas under Sana, about less than 10%.
Jesus Christ.
Okay.
Yes.
Meaning as
like it scares about the whole level and vision of UN in Yemen. Shouldn't be doing more development, less than life-saving, and more thoughtful long-term conversations. We're 10 years of a war. Maybe we will be there in 10 years.
Yeah, okay. So the thing about what does development mean? What's for me, the big difference between humanitarian and development is who decides what's happening, right? When you do development, I've been working in, my last post was in Pakistan. Mm-hmm. Development country. When you do development, that means that you sit down with the government and you say to the government, okay, what do we, what's your vision? What's your plan? What are you going to do? How can we in the UN support you to do development? Development has to be led by the people of that, of the state, and even more so the state. That's a very difficult conversation to have in Sana right now. Right? So to do development, you need a minimum context of governance and a political context which is conducive to that, which regressively we do not have. So we are left to do life-saving and life-sustaining. Incredibly important. Now.
But you still have no criteria about what's life-saving versus no?
No, we do, absolutely. Very, very simple. We have a humanitarian response plan. What's in the humanitarian response plan is either life-saving or what we call as life-sustaining, which is creating the conditions for life-saving. So everything that is in the humanitarian response plan, we consider to be that. And we have internally within the UN, we have a series of very clear indicators on what makes an activity life-saving.
I want to go back to the conversation on October 7th, Gaza, the place of the UN in the world. But before that, I want to build up on what you said about you have 65% of your operation in the north, more or less, or the staff, not operation.
Correct.
And I have two questions in relation to that. Number one is, what do you think of the fact that there is no international diplomacy in Sana'a since 2015?
What do I think about that?
Yes.
I think it's lonely.
Was it a mistake of the US, the UK, Western countries to leave Sana'a and leave the Houthis to their own monster worldviews?
Well, the decision about whether or not member states have staff, diplomatic or otherwise, in Sana'a is not something that I can.
No, it's not your business. But did it make your job worse in negotiating with the Houthis or neutral?
What makes it very difficult is that, I remember, back in 2013, 2017, you'd be, as an international community, you'd be talking to people who, you'd be sitting down, in Yamafraj and Albania, and, we'd be all seeing the same reality, right? And they left in 2015, and some of them stayed on and they knew Yemen, but increasingly that's not the case. So increasingly I engage with people who've never been to Yemen, or if they have done, they've limited themselves to Aden, or maybe they got out to Taiz or Mukalla, but very limited engagement from the international community. Obviously, many Yemenis working for embassies as well. And the difficulty is that when you tell them what you're seeing in Sana'a or in other parts of the country, it's very difficult for them necessarily to believe you, or to understand what where you're coming from. You say something like, well, actually it's got a bit better to work with the in Sana'a in the last months, and they go, my goodness, Stockholm syndrome, complicit. He's fallen for the.
But you still
for the narrative. So
you did have said twice it's better the last month, but I still haven't heard how.
Yeah. Okay. So you didn't give me the chance to answer the question. Okay. So
I've missed you a long time.
Yeah. So I miss you too. So look, about 6 weeks ago, there was what they refer to as the government of change and reconstruction was established, and a series of again, one has to be careful about the language, but they refer to themselves as ministers in Sana'a, and some of them are working to remove some of the constraints on our humanitarian operations in Yemen. We're also working with them to see what we can about releasing colleagues. Not yet on that. We've yet to be successful, although there is little progress. On the humanitarian operations, up until about 2 months ago, almost every week we would have an international colleague asked to leave for various reasons from Sana'a. That stopped. It would take us occasionally months to get visas for colleagues. Now we mostly get visas in a couple of days. There are some program agreements for international NGOs which were blocked for 2-3 years, never got signed. We have some of these agreements which are now being signed in 2-3 days. So the ability to travel, most areas, we've always had a pretty good ability to travel in de facto areas. That's become easier. There's still difficulties around monitoring.
The biometrics, you mean?
About anything to do with data. Data surveys is always something that's, min zaman, has always been a very sensitive point with the authorities, and that remains difficult. But there's lots of sort of day-to-day operational stuff which in the last 6 weeks has improved. How long will that stay? Can't tell you. But
On your
today,
point,
yes.
On your point on data,
Yeah.
which is to me the most important thing in life as a researcher, how do you do data in these problems you have in access? How do you really know that Yemen is the worst humanitarian crisis in the world? I don't believe that.
Well, you said the worst. I didn't.
The UN said that, not me.
Well, I mean, I think I can't remember. I'm not sure which statement you're.
No, but like in 2018, 17, that
Sure.
was the trend. Is Yemen is the worst. But I genuinely like. How do you evaluate also not just how bad it is, but also how do you make sure that your aid is reaching the right people?
Sure.
And how do you make sure that you can collect the right evaluation
Yeah.
when you're afraid? So data, I find it with no access, with no diplomats in the ground, with no independence, is quite a problem. Can you reflect on that?
Yeah, sure. Well, look, I mean, as I mentioned earlier, we have 3,000 staff in 10 different locations, and we travel everywhere. Myself, since I've been back, I've been to Sada, Hajja, Hodayda, Ib, Taiz, Aden, Mocha, Mukalla, Sayoun. So, we've got staff all over the country who are professionals who've been working in Yemen, and, they've got eyes in their heads and brains. And, yes, data, obviously everybody loves national studies that are comparable across countries. We all love that. It's very important to have that, and I get it, right? But also a trust in the knowledge and professionalism of humanitarian workers. People who've been working for 20 years in humanitarian conflict. You can get into an area, you visit a health centre, you pretty much work out very quickly what the situation is in that health centre, right? So the combined knowledge of professionals who've been working for decades across the country is a very important factor. The second thing is we have limited nationwide studies, but we do have some, particularly on the nutrition side, and we have multiple localized studies of food security, nutrition, and other situations. So we do have sufficient data in order to be able to make these statements. We know that for nutrition, the highest caseload of malnourished children in the world, not percentage, absolute numbers, second highest country in the world, Yemen. We know that for food insecurity, caseload of food insecure people, third highest in the world is Yemen. And for both of those, we're talking about population about 17 million people in need. For access to health and health challenges, second highest caseload in the world. So we're not here into sort of comparing which is the most horrendous situation to be living in as a civilian, but Yemen, Yemenis, people in Yemen, because it's not just Yemenis, it's also people from the Horn of Africa. They need assistance, they need help.
I want to come back to that and specifically the data, but going back to your earlier point about a lot of push to basically reallocate to the south, the operation of the UN, and you saying 65% is in the north. A lot of donors I hear recently are saying that we should just shut down all operations in the north and move to the south. What do you think of that?
Well, I'm a humanitarian. I'm here for Yemenis, right? And the idea of just abandoning millions of people whose lives will worsen, children who will die, let's be really clear about it, for me is unconscionable. I mean, I just can't accept that as a possibility. It's true that some donors have decided to make financial decisions to reallocate. But with the United Nations, we're driven by humanity, neutrality, and impartiality. And as long as we can find donors to support us or internal resources, we will use that money to support the people in the greatest need. We need to do a better job at making sure that the most vulnerable receive that assistance, and we need to make a good job at making sure that our money doesn't get diverted into areas where it shouldn't be. But yeah, we need to keep at that. The other thing is, I'll leave it there.
Is that the same position of UK, US, Russia, and China on cutting on from the north?
Maybe ask them, and some of them are in the room. But I think one of the things which I find amazing, and this is that despite this very tense relationship between those many member states, and the authorities in Sana'a, I think it's extraordinary they continue to provide humanitarian assistance. They don't have to. The US could say, right, you're blowing us up, you're on your own, mate. The Brits could say the same. And I think it is, I think it's deeply admirable that many, the people inside those member states who were in the aid community continue to provide assistance and continue to push that. I think that's extraordinary, given the political and context. Yeah.
Can I push you a bit more on that, please? So post-October 7, the entire world of multilateralism and post-Ukraine war has really tore apart the entire idea of objectivity, but also multilateralism, solidarity, international. The UK, the US also went further when they started bombing the Houthis. So in a way, you're almost saying, which I think, the world has responded to Yemen with drones, envoys, and humanitarian aid, And that has applied to the UK, to the US, but with the conversation that's happening on Gaza, on Lebanon at the moment, the indifference towards Sudan, the absolute obsession with Ukraine in the West, where do you see the place in the world from a little bit of more multilateralism, I guess not double standards, but principality of that? Isn't that much more fragile?
I was in southern Lebanon in 2006 after the conflict. I have family in Sudan and friends working in Gaza and Palestine, and the international indifference to what's going on is deeply hurtful, on a personal level, and for anyone who works in the United Nations or our friends and colleagues, and so many of our colleagues in Yemen are from Gaza and from the West Bank or from Lebanon. So it's painful for us to see this. We in the UN will keep pushing for humanity, neutrality, and impartiality, and we will keep repeating that message until we become very boring. And I don't care if people don't want to hear it. We need to keep pushing that message, and I would encourage everybody to keep pushing that message. There is a need for multilateralism. The people who are touched by these conflicts are not the conflict. They're not pushing the conflict. So yeah.
I want to open it in any minute for anyone who has any question in the room. One last question before that is about GCC. Also their place in the current. How much do you think that the Saudis going so far with the Houthis in war and in peace has influenced their recent behavior?
I think any... from both a humanitarian perspective and a for peace and for solutions, it's quite normal for any conflict for the neighbours to be the potential solutions to that conflict. You look at the way that Europe has reacted to Ukraine. European member states, what goes on in Ukraine touches them so much more because they're the neighbours. Right? I've worked in Congo, and the positions of neighbouring member states, their ability, they can help build solutions. They can also make it worse, right? So to make sure that the neighbourhood is a central part of any discussion, be it in terms of peace processes or humanitarian assistance, absolutely vital. One of the things that I'm trying to do on the humanitarian side is to have a much greater conversation with member states in the Gulf than we've done so in the past. And I think that it's vital that they are an active voice in the discussion about how we respond, how we do a humanitarian response in Yemen.
Good.
Thank you.
25 minutes. I'll start her, and then the lady in the back. Please start. Say your name and where you work from. We have, yeah.
My name is Richard Castle. I'm a General Counsel, Head of Legal. So I've got a legal background in international law. I've worked in an emerging market, Papua New Guinea, just above Australia. It's got a big mining industry. I'm interested in international conflicts. In particular, what you're talking about in Yemen, it seems to be one of the biggest humanitarian crises. 20 million people that you're saying that have been affected. I did read that brief in the Chatham House website about the design of the humanitarian plan. What are your priorities and goals? It seems that you're absolutely failing, because if in 2024 there's 18 million people affected, 2025 predicted to have 19 million affected. Looks like you're failing in terms of your goals, your priorities, and your design. So what do you propose to do then in order to reduce the amount of people affected by this humanitarian crisis if you're actually doing a proper job there? But at the same time, you haven't addressed neutrality. You're saying 40% of the funding is coming from the US and from the UK, but whereas the US and the UK are actually bombing Yemen. So it seems that there's something that you're not telling us. So how can you address those two issues?
The lady in the back will take another question, and then we'll do rounds, and then we'll come here and go ahead.
Thank you so much. Anna Chernova from the Foreign Policy Center. I wanted to bring us back a little bit to the humanitarian operations in the north, but also a bit in the south. I'm curious about what it's like for Yemeni women in particular, especially considering mahram restrictions. I've been reading about that. I think there's a common position, if I understand, that mahram costs are not paid or are paid by different agencies. So I just wanted to hear, how have women been coping that are working for aid agencies that have to move about in northern Yemen, and whether you think there is a difference between north and south in terms of gender inequalities, and if there's an implication for the peace process in general. Next year is Women, Peace and Security, 25 years, so wanted to hear your views on that. Thank you so much.
Good. So I have 3 questions. You guys continue to fail upward.
Thank you.
He says, not me. And then number 2 is a question about the independence. You almost touched on this earlier. How do you have the 2 biggest humanitarian aid funders for Yemen, US and UK, bombing Yemen? And then you have a third question about mahram. And I want to add a little bit to that, is about your red lines. That was supposed to almost be negotiated in the past, and now it's coming again. And how do you basically continue to do that? So 3 good questions, and then we'll come back to the next round. But yours.
We're succeeding. If you look at case fatality rate for cholera, it's at 0.34%. Normally, if you have a cholera epidemic and you're not responding properly, your case fatality rates are normally in the 1 to 2% range, sometimes higher. So we are saving lives. The issue comes back to this issue of development, right? Humanitarian action will not reduce your caseload over time. Right? if you have malnourished children and you give a humanitarian solution to that, you're not solving the underlying problems of malnutrition in Yemen. You're curing those children who become sick with malnutrition, and you're saving their lives. But you're not going to make the malnutrition situation, the underlying situation, any better. Yemeni children will continue to be malnourished, right? The only way you can reduce the level of malnutrition, the only way that you can improve the underlying health condition is moving to development, which is why that is our aspiration. So that's, we are successful from a humanitarian perspective, but there's so much more that needs to be done for Yemen, and development is the key to that.
UK, US?
In terms of, it was about 10 o'clock at night in Hodeidah. This is about 4 or 5 months ago, and in a long conversation with some leaders from what was called Scamshire at the time, which is and that's another thing that's changed. Scamshire's been abolished, right?
That's a question I have for you on the Zoom. We'll come to it.
Yeah. So Scamshire, which is this aid coordination body, which was for the de facto authorities, it was like 11 o'clock at night. We've been talking about things about getting some assistance going for about 4 or 5 hours. Long night, and and the leader in front of me said to me, so look, what is it about the Americans? Why is it that they're making it so difficult to provide food assistance? Is it because of our political ideology, our views? And it was like, no, it's because you keep firing rockets at their ships. And they kind of went, yeah, good point, actually. We can see that, right? So, it's bizarre to be in this situation, but I can't talk for them, but I assume that the reason that they do that is because they do not have an argument with the Yemeni people. Right? They have an argument with policy, the choices that the leadership in Sana makes. Right? That's their argument. It is, and hence the way they provide humanitarian assistance. That's my understanding of their position, but you'd have to ask them.
But it doesn't have to do with the armed deals.
With
a lot of billions of dollars of weapons they sell on Yemen's war since 2015.
Well, I've no view on that. I just think it's essential that we continue to provide humanitarian assistance.
The Mahram question?
Yeah. So. Very complicated. And I hesitate to talk about this in front of Helen, who knows these things way better than me, but there is a distinction between the way that aid workers are treated on this issue from general Yemeni society. Right? So, obviously, the cultural attitudes within Yemen vary deeply. Different parts of, the attitudes on women's position in society in, say, Sada is very different from Taiz City or Ib, or so there's a huge variation. And even within those areas, there will be different variations within the same governorate. Attitudes within families will vary. The issue about the restriction that was placed on international aid workers or people working for international aid workers, which was put in place about 2 years ago, is specific to us. It's a problem because it stops. One, it's it's deeply unpleasant for my colleagues, but it's also, and it's wrong. But also, it stops us doing the best possible job we can do for Yemenis, because if there's particularly in certain parts of Yemen that there are places where a man could not conceivably engage with women patients, and therefore it threatens the lives of women patients. And so it is a very significant problem for us. It is applied only to the employees of those organisations in this strict way. We are working to try and find a solution to that, but it's very difficult, and we're not there yet.
What if you don't find a solution in 6 months? Going back to the number one criticism about you, what is your red line? Because I agree with you with the engagement, with the compromising. You have to continue to be in the ground. But where do you say, enough, and you back home and go home? Do you ever do that? Or maybe we're asking the wrong questions from an aid worker point of view, for example.
Well, you know, I'm a humanitarian. We keep going, and there is no end point.
That applies to Israel and Gaza?
You'll see that my colleagues are still in Gaza, they're still in the West Bank, they're still in the southern Lebanon. I was talking to friends last night in southern Lebanon. We keep going.
It's almost sad, like how the multilateral world is so weak at the moment, for someone like you.
Well, I think the issue is not with the humanitarians. The challenge does not lie with the humanitarians. It lies on the political front. I think the humanitarians are incredibly strong at this time. Who are the voices that you hear? Who are the people that you see? It's the humanitarians on the front lines. We're strong. It's the political solutions that are weak.
One question, and then one. So let's go. Please do not exceed 30 seconds. I know we have a lot. You start with you. One question. Here you go. Please say your name and go.
Helen Lackner. I have actually more than one question, but only one I'm expecting you to answer. And you have already vaguely mentioned it, which is really, I wanted to understand a little bit more about what is happening, in what sense the cancellation of Skamsha and its replacement by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs is actually improving the situation. I think you've hinted that it is improving the situation, but what fundamental changes it's making to this? And if I can just one more thing, is to what extent the financial crisis in Sana'a is affecting your work? Thank you.
And let's go. Have one question. Let me take a round.
Hi, Damien McElroy from the National. I just wondered if you could talk a little bit about whether the various military strikes have had any impact, or what kind of impact they've had on humanitarian operations. And allied to that, is there anything in the undergrowth that would suggest, the political side of things will start up again in terms of where we were, say, 4 years ago?
Good. And let's go to the the young man. Please.
Yeah, thank you very much indeed. Ewan Grant, United Kingdom Defence Forum. I worked in Sana'a for the World Bank as a contractor. Over 10 years ago, I saw what was coming. My question is, the UN Secretary General's visit to Kazan. Now, Egypt was there and Iran was there, and of course, we've heard the latest allegations about Victor Bout being back with Sana'a. Did the Secretary General... Did the Secretary General...
I didn't catch that.
Sorry, we've heard the latest news about Victor Bout allegedly being back with the Sana'a regime. So did the Secretary General raise the issue of getting humanitarian aid accelerated, given who was there? And if so, what was the reaction and what was said? Thank you.
Let's go to you back. And I just want to expand a bit on, I'll come back to you, on Helen's question about the Skamsha, because there is a question from Ali Mayas online on Zoom about it, has the Skamsha really been disbanded? That's a good question, even if we read in the news. And then how is your relationship with the new Minister of Foreign Affairs? And then we go back to the airstrikes, and possibly if we're going back to square zero. And are you ready for that, if we go for a square zero? Because I think that's the blind spot that everyone is not ready for. and then question of the gentleman. So can we go through this? We have like...
Okay, so Magister l'Insaniyya. I mean, firstly, bonjour Hélène, c'est un grand plaisir de vous voir. From an operational perspective, yeah, it's made a lot of. It's much easier to operate for the reasons I mentioned. You know, we're not getting people kicked out every week, which we were doing. So we're getting the visas. INGOs are getting agreements which they weren't previously getting, including an American INGO recently got an agreement which had been blocked for several years. So it is, and also the just the meetings are shorter. You know, sort of like 3-4 months ago, you know, you'd go into the meeting, you'd sort of go, you know, about an hour or so of being told how wrong we all were and hypocrites, and everything was, you know, terrible, and, you know, our multiple deficiencies, and then you'd eventually sort of get to the subject of the conversation and the more operational side. And now, you know, our discussions are much more focused on the operational problem at hand to resolve. Now, that doesn't change the underlying power structures that are in place in Sana, right? That changes the interface. And so the constraints on things like data. So it changes the tone of the conversation, but it doesn't necessarily change some of. Well, my belief is that, well, there's a big conversation there, but I think that you need to analyse what's going on with the government of change and reconstruction. Why? Because that came with that. You know, why did that government come into pass? What was the context of that? Why? What's driven that? What's the political background to that? And I think you'll get the answers. You'll get the answers there. But I think, you know, there was within Yemeni society, even in the north, there was a certain dissatisfaction with Skamsha.
Are you ready to go back to?
Yes.
4 years ago?
Look, we as part of our normal operations, Damien, we do scenario planning. Be it for any subject, rains, climate change, possibility of renewal of conflict on the front lines with Marib, on the front lines with Mocha and with Saudi Arabia. So we prepare those scenarios, but we prepare those scenarios not with a view to saying that we have an understanding of where it's going. We don't have a crystal ball, but we prepare scenarios because as humanitarian operators, you need to be ready.
Let's go to Anne. In a praise of short meetings.
Sorry, on the UN had a question on the Secretary General. So
yes.
I do not know the answer to what precisely the Secretary General said there, but I do know that the Secretary General has not only engaged very publicly on the matter of the release of my colleagues, but he has consistently called upon world leaders in member states who might have influence in his discussions with them to call upon the release of all detainees, but particularly of the United Nations, because one, these are our colleagues. He is the head of the United Nations, and two, he recognises that this is a fundamental part of any possibility to improve things in Yemen.
Let's go with Anne. Yes. There was one hand held somewhere. Yeah. Okay.
Hi. Annie Slamrod, the New Humanitarian. On the subject of red lines, the WFP paused general food assistance in the north in last December. My understanding is it was restarted, at least to some degree, in September with a pilot program, including some registration and data, which I know was a sticking point in the past. I'm wondering if you could tell us how it's going. Is it fully restarted? And what was, if you're able to comment, what the red line was that stopped it in December?
We had a question here in the back, gentleman there.
Hi, thank you very much for coming to speak to us today. My name's Lawrence, I work at the Foreign Office. Thank you for laying out the 3 areas of your engagement. It's useful to understand you have on one side the government and of course the donors, and on the other side also the principal aid agencies that you work with. And thinking also, just for practicality terms, it's useful to have a single head of the UN within a country, but I wondered if you could comment on your experience of whether the HCRC position is set up for success, if it's structured correctly. And that's thinking about the role of DCO in relation to mandated UN agencies, but it's also thinking about the realities of a role that depends upon the parties of the conflict to their physical presence in the country. Thank you.
Is there last question, someone there?
So I think that was a job interview question. But yeah, thank you, Lawrence.
Let's go to one more lesson from our colleague from the Africa program. Yes.
Thank you very much, ESG. I'm Robert, a visiting fellow here at Chatham House. I want to refer to your question about the timeline for the operations of the UN mission. Is it against the background of negative sentiment against the UN mission in Yemen? And secondly, sir, I wonder if you could explain a little bit more about the humanitarian assistance, because you were previously you said the humanitarian assistance is not really a development solution. So maybe you want to talk about the transition between the humanitarian assistance and development assistance. Thank you very much.
If you're short, then we will get one more round, but you go for it.
Okay, so firstly, new humanitarian, I'm a big fan, so thank you very much. Please say nice things about us.
You don't know her coming. You don't know her coming story.
Okay, so the complex question on which obviously Colin Lynch has covered in quite some detail, but basically last year WFP was faced with 2 issues. One was reducing funding, and then there was questions as to how accurately was targeting being done, problems of inclusion and exclusion. And so WFP is in a transition to a more targeted programming. And that, again, this is the challenge of being a humanitarian organization. So your donor's the US, principally, and they have demands. And then you're in front of Scamshire, who are deeply suspicious. They don't want to give out data, and there's some of their concerns about data is how would that data get used, and et cetera. And there's a certain amount of paranoia, and so you as an organization are trying to resolve that, and that's the challenge that WFP's been facing in the last year. It's incredibly difficult, right? And I really salute my friends and colleagues who've been trying to make it work. They have increased, after almost a year without general food distribution in the north, they have started to do some food distribution, but the numbers are way lower than they should be. If we look at how much, basically we do about twice as much food distribution in the south than we do in the north, whereas the needs are the opposite, right? They're reversed. There's actually far more absolute needs and relative needs in the north than there are in the south. So we have a real challenge there to be able to maintain impartiality. They're continuing to work on it, and yeah.
Can you address his question very, very quickly in less than 30 seconds in regards humanitarianism, the RC?
Right, yeah.
It's important because I do think you're set up for failure. What do you say?
Well, that would answer the earlier question. Why am I failing? Because of the HC.
No, but like, what's the red line between humanitarian diplomacy and how do you juggle that balance?
Okay,
It's
so
important.
so if as an HCRC, we don't get involved in diplomacy, right? And my functions are humanitarian, development, security of my colleagues. I think I'm doing all right. Not everybody would necessarily agree with that assessment. I think it's within the international system that has been created by the member states, it is the best possible solution, right? So the member states created a series of UN specialized agencies, each that has their own separate board, none of them who report formally to the Secretary General, right? So, and then what they do is you put all those agencies in a country like Yemen, and then you say to the HCRC, well, go on then, fix it, mate, and that is without any, with a very limited connection at the top, right? So the work is about building consensus over time with your colleagues to get a shared view. It's fascinating, challenging work, but it takes time. And that often leads to frustration from our partners who expect the coordinator to be able to go in and flick a switch and it's all good, right? A very different world from anything else. That it's not like in the business sector. I did years ago. I did an MBA in France, and all of my mates are in business, and they just go in and say like, we're going to do this and we're going to do that, and my world is nothing to do with that, right? And so it's very challenging, but I think the HCRC system works increasingly well in that context.
The IT is already giving me a look. We're 1 minute late, but on that question on having an MBA, if you were an investor, not a humanitarian working in Yemen, what's the potential of Yemen? If you went there as an investor, not an aid worker, and the Yemenis, and we have 20 seconds.
Well, I mean, أنا أحب اليمن. So I think Yemen has extraordinary potential. Anybody who's ever been there, just the people, the country, the culture, the history, the economic potential, the agriculture. There was a time a long time ago when Yemen was an economic powerhouse for the region, there is that potential. One day we will get there.
On that note, on what it could be and the potential, not just what it is right now, I want to thank everyone so much for coming this Monday and everyone who has been online, but also very much for your work and for making the time to be in a Chatham House. Hopefully this will be more of an ongoing conversations. You can follow our work at chathamhouse.org, those who are online. But thank you very much, and until the next one. Thank you.